Welcome back. In session 8, we're going to talk about the last of the 6 lead types. And this is really one of my favorite lead types and one that a lot of people will default to because it's very versatile and you can actually use it across that awareness spectrum. But it can be especially useful if you're down at that end where you're trying to reach a customer, you don't know anything about what they're aware of, what they know, where they are. You maybe have an idea that something that you have out there is that they would find useful, but you're not even sure if they're aware of the problem that they have. And you want to find a way to connect with those people. And this can be a great way to do it. So what is a story lead? I like to go back and think about we talked about how people just can't resist hearing a secret that they might be not plugged into, that how people who are very aware of something can't resist a great deal if the deal is presented, if they are aware of stuff. But there's something about stories that connects all of us. People just love to hear a good story, a well-told story. This is a cave painting that is about 40,000 years old. Those cave paintings were people who had the urge to communicate something that is some event that was going on to somebody else to see what happened. Why would anybody need even to put that information up on the wall of a cave so dark that you can barely see it unless you go in there with fire or some other way, you have a crack in the rocks to see it? Because we have this compulsion to relate what happens to other people and we package it up into stories. And people are equally on the other side welcome to receive a story if they feel that that story is going to be well told and have something important in it for them. Here is a classic story lead that you most certainly have seen. Many people have seen and studied this piece. This was the famous Tale of Two Men letter for the Wall Street Journal. This was written by Martin Conroy and possibly also a model off of something else that was a Tale of Two Men promotion that was written decades earlier than this. But on a beautiful late spring afternoon, 25 years ago, 2 young men graduated from the same college. So right away, we're jumping right in and we realize that something's happening. We already know that there's some characters and something's about to change. And we see even there's a hint of something's about to happen to these 2 men. They were very much alike, these 2 young men. Both had been better than average students. Both were personable and both, as young college graduates are, were filled with ambitious dreams for the future. Now, don't you feel already you're starting to care for these people? You're not really quite sure why you're being told this story, but you want to know what happened to these guys. What happens to the 2 guys who get out of college? Recently, these men returned to their college for their 25th reunion. They were still very much alike. Both were happily married, both had 3 children, and both, it turned out, had gone to work for the same Midwestern manufacturing company after graduation and were still there. But there was a difference. One of the men was a manager of a small department of that company. The other was its president. So now we have this drama, and it's set up. We have to know how their paths diverge. What is the big difference here that made that happen? So there's a secret here that we feel like we want to be told. There's a promise here that figuring out how to be the president and not the manager of the small department is implied. But it's all packaged up in this story, which just takes that whole message and just transports it to you in a very easy way to absorb it. You want to hear the story. This went on to sell $2 billion worth of subscriptions for the Wall Street Journal. It was one of the most successful sales letters ever written. It's a very indirect type of lead because it just goes all the stuff about the product and all that other stuff, that gets pushed to the side and says, just hold on a second, I just want to tell you a story. And when people say, can I tell you a story? Already we feel like that there might be some value to having that story told. Okay, so a story, how do you tell a story? Telling a story is an art. You have to polish, you've got to figure out how to start telling that story. You have to figure out what is the dramatic turning point in that story. You have to have a feel for it. So often when a story starts, it starts right in the middle of the action. You can think of a favorite movie. Where do movies often start? They rarely start with the guy doing the most mundane things that are part of the day. If you're in an action movie, it usually starts in an action. You're in a scene and all of a sudden a car bursts over a hill and there's a chase underway, or there's a match that drops and it hits a fuse. that puts you right into it, and you really want to find out what's going to happen next. So here's a sample. At 4:20 on a sunny Thursday afternoon, I was sitting on the front stoop of our tidy brick home, my 7-week-old baby on my lap, when my husband came home and told me he just lost his job. You can imagine here the music, dun dun dun, queuing up. You hear something, some dramatic moment is happening. We've got to find out what happens. Now, her husband just lost her job. She's sitting on the stoop with a baby on her lap. All of a sudden, we are thrust into a moment where we need to know what's going to happen next. Instead of panicking, we went out for sushi. What? That's really a twist. Throws us. Now I got to find out why they didn't panic. That's different from anything that I've seen. So this is a different, unique story. Okay, like all good storytelling, you want to have details and dialogue and make them feel like something's happening. They want to go into the scene. So it's important that you're going to have these, what we call actualities. And actuality is that tiny detail that lends this quality of truth to the thing that you're saying, that it actually happened. So again, if you think about the movie thing and you think about a scene, you go back and you look at the scene, there's going to be somebody there whose job is to look for continuity errors. They're going to try and make sure that every detail fits with what you're saying. There was a thing where a lot of people like to watch Downton Abbey, and they lined up the characters from Downton Abbey. They all got into their fancy dress costumes. They set all the lighting like the lighting should be in that period in England at that time. And they went and they took the pictures and they printed the pictures and they put them out with the publicity stuff. And it was only then that they realized that one of the technicians, one of the aides, had left their plastic water bottle on the mantelpiece behind that picture. And now all of a sudden, everything that they did to try to make that look like a real scene from that period is ruined because that little bottle is on the counter and it ruins the continuity. Well, the inverse is also true. If you get those details right, those little things that you might not notice, those little rich details have a way of making that feel more present, that you're in the story, that you understand that story. Here's a sample where it says, "Wow, you sure have a green thumb." Okay, so what do we get even just from that headline? It's a piece of dialogue and a quote. So we want to know who said that and who are they saying it to, and also how does this person have such a green thumb for growing a perfect garden or plants. The story continues. "My neighbors, Bob and Karen, stood wide-eyed admiring my garden." Okay, now we're still here. We have Bob and Karen. We're starting to picture Bob and Karen. We're starting to picture the great garden, but we also got this implied promise that's coming out. Her garden is being admired. She's getting respect because she has this great garden. "Roses around your porch, marigolds in your borders, a vegetable patch full of tomatoes, squash, carrots. And what's that? Brussels sprouts. It's amazing." So it goes on to continue that story in this thing. So it sets it up. You know, once we get here in the lead, we're going to find out how she managed to impress Bob and Karen and everybody else who gets to look at her gorgeous garden. You have to make sure that when you tell a story that it opens, like that in the action, has a beginning. Then it has to be a point where there's a turn here. So in that little story we saw about the husband losing his job and then going after sushi, we get to the middle of the story where we open up, say, instead of panicking, they went out to go get sushi. So we want to find out, okay, we're in our middle of our story. And then it has to have an end where we find out how we're going to transition from the story into actually talking to the prospect about what's going on and find out why they told us that story. In promotions, you have to, just like in any other storytelling, you have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So here's one where it's telling a story about J. Peterman mailbag that you can buy. Now, J. Peterman was famous, J. Peterman catalog was famous for using stories to sell everything that they did. That made that thing have the gravity, and people would want to get the J. Peterman catalog just to read the stories. So here, the counterfeit mailbag. "I borrowed the original from a friend, a retired mailman, who, like thousands before him, was kind enough to test it out on the tree-lined streets of small towns everywhere, before we were born." So we're thinking back, we're thrown back to that memory of that mailman walking around with the bag on the streets, dropping off the mail. You know, that's the way it used to be done. It was simply perfect as a device for carrying important ideas and feelings back and forth, and the same as with those old and scarce and beautiful mailbags, people will look forward to seeing what you've got inside. So now we've got the story taking us to this place where the mailbag is more than just a mailbag. It's not just a thing that hangs on somebody's shoulder and looks nice. It carries around things that are important, memories and messages, and things that can change people's lives or improve their lives. The counterfeit mailbag, number 1005, containing the counterfeit mailbag, okay, containing one vast unzippered pocket and another zippered shoulder strap and handle, strong, soft leather, going to get better, imported, color brown. How do you take it? So we have all of a sudden gone from this thing, the beginning where we talked about the mailman walking around and what it was like, get to that, where we get to the end is that here it is and it's only gotten even better. That's a very short part here where we hear this little story told. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. What you have to make sure of, though, is that you don't get lost in telling the story. This is the same as where we talk about in problem solution, where we're talking about agitating the problem just long enough so that they understand that you understand where they are and what they feel. When you're using a story to tell, you want to be the person who knows how to tell the story with that perfect pacing. That often means that you have to rewrite and retell that story and print until you get it just right. But everybody's had that experience where they are telling a story, say, go back to our cocktail party analogy, and sometimes you get it right and everybody's leaning forward, they want to hear, and then when you're done, they all laugh because the punchline comes in perfect landing, or they all have that emotional reaction that you hope that they have. Or you tell the story and you get lost in it, and you're in the middle and you go off on a tangent, you bring in a character that doesn't matter, it doesn't ever really end, or it's just loaded with details about what the scene is like. Then you're going to lose people's interest. They wanted to have a story, they wanted to get to that feeling, and you betrayed that because you took too much time to get to it. It's very important to keep it moving. You tell as much of the story as you need to get to the punchline, which is that transition to talking about the product. Here is an example of a fundraising letter. Now, fundraising is especially good place to look for story leads because people have found that when you go out with a fundraising pitch, somebody might come out and say, here where this is somebody who's living on $1.25 a day. She's a widowed mother of 2 girls in the African country of Malawi, if I'm pronouncing that right. It goes through to talk about what her life is like. Somebody could have started here. Most families there survive by farming plots of land. Women are the backbone of the country's rural economy, responsible for 80% of the food production, yet they're frequently not allowed to own or manage land or other assets. Men control crop sales and households' money. A lot of people might have started out a fundraising letter with something statistical like that, something general or some big picture image like that, that they would hope that those things would be persuasive because there's proof that there's a problem. But instead, backing out and showing this story, talking about Benitez, the woman that's here, pictured here, now we have a face to it. We have a person. And it becomes more real to us than if we were talking about the statistical thing. We can hear about deaths that happen in tragedies, an earthquake here or a hurricane there, and it's tragic that so many people are lost, but they become a statistic. When it's one person that you're talking about, then you really start feeling something. You have a connection to that person, and maybe you can even picture yourself or somebody you care about in that same situation. So here, instead, they just tell her story right here, just up to there, and then they make that transition into that point where they're talking about the larger big picture of this. Like in any story, the story has to have some kind of drama. That means it's got to have some kind of promise that the next part is going to get more and more interesting as you go, and it's building up to some kind of climax. So this goes all the way back to Aristotle and the arc of a story where you're introducing a character, the character runs into some kind of problem and gets to some kind of peak, and then some kind of quick resolution. Stories are all told in that same way. Drama is part of the story. It has to be compelling. It has to move you along. And you have to also remember, this helps when you're afraid that you're telling too much of the story, always remember that the reason that you're telling the story is to get a certain result. You remember way back when we talked about in the first session about the power of one and how you wanted to make sure that the idea that you were getting to come across, that you understood what that result is that you wanted to have, one clear result. You're telling this story for one clear reason. You want to get that person engaged in what you have to say to the level that they will listen to the sales message that you're eventually going to deliver. You know that you're going to eventually try and transition that to a sale. So the story has to be relevant to that sale that you're going to try to make, and it has to be relevant to the listener because that's how you connect the two. As we saw with all the other leads, a story lead also has to target a certain emotion. We react to things, we react to stories. We hear a sad story. We don't think to ourselves, and now I shall feel sad because of the points that are made. You simply feel a certain way, and then you figure out an instant later why it made you feel that way, or you feel happy, or you feel angry. That story is trying to reach out and contact those emotions first, because it's trying to make a connection with a person who may not be aware that even those emotions are there, but those emotions are channeled, stirred up and channeled by telling this story. So here is a letter for Covenant House about a guy who's been through a tough situation growing up, and it was turned around by somebody who looked out for him. And he now wants this opportunity to give back. So the story is about that change, that transition for him, that journey for him, and then what he wants to do with it. But it's a very emotional story about how difficult it was, how the fighting and the abuse that happened when he was a child, and how hard it was, and then turns that back around into some kind of promise. But you feel like you're in his situation. You're often going to see, with a lot of these leads, you're going to see them combined with other types of leads. So somebody might tell a story that is also going to reveal a secret, or somebody might tell a story that justifies some kind of big problem, a story about a problem somebody has. Or you might find certainly that it's going to be combined with a promise lead, so that a story is going to be told in order to deliver a promise. Here's one that says, 2 drops is all it took to rub out pain without pills or surgery. So here we are in the quotes, and we find out, we see this couple down here. We feel like there's more to that story. It's not just that these drops are going to wipe out pain. That's just a straight promise. Instead, it's packaged up like a story. We want to hear about this guy. What was the pain that he had? How did he come to know about these drops to take? And what happened when he took the drops? How fast were the results? Packaged in the story, we're willing to hear it. There's another promotion that we don't have up here, but that I remember, where there was an arthritis drug, and they were sending this out in a promise promotion that was saying that if you were to take this, I don't remember whether it's some kind of supplement, if you were to take this supplement, it would get rid of your pain. So it was just a basic promise lead saying something, erase your arthritis pain by taking this supplement. They sent it out. It did okay. They got a letter back from somebody. And in the letter, the guy who wrote the letter said, "Dear so-and-so, I almost threw out the letter that saved my life." Or I almost threw out your letter, which went on to save my life. And went on to tell the story about how he was a farmer and how he got up at 4:30 in the morning to go out to his fields, and he would get the tractor and everything. But as he got older, his knees and his hands and elbows and shoulders and things like that were stiff from this arthritis, and it was increasingly hard for him to do his work, but he needed to do his work because he needed to keep the farm running in order to have money to survive. So he said he was at his wit's end because he didn't have a solution, so he started trying their product, and sure enough, after a few weeks, he was waking up with less pain, he was less stiff, and he was able to continue his farming. And he was writing to tell them that when he got the letter, he thought, oh, here's somebody promising a solution. I'm not sure it's going to work for me, but okay, I'll give it a try. He almost threw it out, but then he tried it. So they went back, a smart copywriter took that, and he said, that's a fantastic story. They turned it around. They were going to use a stock photo, but then they decided, why not just use the picture of this guy, this farmer, let's say he's Farmer Bob. He is there, he's a big guy, he's wearing overalls. He's got a face made for radio, but he is the perfect model of a customer who might need to use this product. And the headline was changed to, in quotes, "I almost threw out the letter that saved my life." And it went on to tell his story just the way that he told it. That all of a sudden takes this little promise and it puts it in a nice big container, a package that's easy to deliver to somebody who wants to hear about somebody who has a situation like them and a solution that maybe they could try to. So this is a great way to dig up these stories, that you might go and you look through your customer testimonials, those things that you're putting in now, like 1 or 2 sentences. See if you can contact those people and say, tell me, is there more of a story here? And then maybe you get to tell that customer story. Or you might go back and look in the history books and you might find somebody else who used this solution some other time before, or some similar solution, or was in a similar situation, and tell that story. Or maybe you just take a news item and you dramatize it. You make it something that's a little more fascinating, like you might see somebody take for one of those news magazine type shows where they dig in and tell almost documentary style what happened to somebody. Here's one that's a product, Our Story, a new solution to stop dog injuries. How we discovered the new solution to an old problem for dog injuries due to slipping and sliding. And it goes on to tell the story about a dog that slipping and sliding, presumably on stairs and things like that. You know, dogs have those problems too, where they run down the stairs or run along a floor and they slide and they get hurt. Well, somebody who has a pet, this is very important to them. But instead of just saying, stop your dog from slipping and sliding, they went on to tell a story of a dog that was somebody who was able to help their dog avoid this problem. By packaging it up in a story, all of a sudden somebody has a dog, they want to hear somebody else's dog story, and then all of a sudden they're reading about this product and this solution that they'd never considered before. You might have a rags to riches story, a failure to success story, a confessional tale. This is probably another one of the most famous sales letters that everybody's ever seen. They laughed when I sat down at the piano, but when I started to play. Now this ad was for a correspondence course that taught you how to play the piano. You could have just written, learn how to play piano by mail, master the piano in 6 weeks or less, or something like that. But instead, he packaged up this story about Arthur, who's at a party, who walks in and he sits down at the piano, and everybody goes, Arthur, he's always kidding around. He doesn't know how to play the piano. And then suddenly he does. All of a sudden, that idea of learning how to play the piano is made more real for the person who hears that story. Who hasn't wanted to be Arthur and walk in and just blow people away by some skill that nobody knew that you had? Everybody's just admiring you and think that you're able to do something that's just incredible. You're always surprising them with your incredible talents. That's so much bigger than just learning how to play the piano. So by putting it in that story, you're able to see it happen. Something else happens there too. It's this idea of, I'm like you. I was this guy too, and I figured out how to do it. That can make you feel more human to them, that promise. They can actually see it happening. They can see it dramatized in their lives as well as the one that you're telling. Here is a famous ad from David Ogilvy, the man in the Hathaway shirt. Now, he did this over and over again. This is classic Ogilvy style with a big photo at the top and then this stuff at the bottom that looks like a little magazine article where he goes through, and instead of just talking about a shirt, he talks about the man in the shirt and why he's such a fascinating character, and he puts him in these scenarios. He actually takes that shirt, using the story of this guy, and he makes it more than just that promise. Changing lives is just not putting on an interesting shirt. So if one of the things that we just talked about in all these things is that when you tell stories, you very rarely tell stories that are not about a person, some kind of identifiable character. That person is right there. Put the human interest in it. That's another reason that we really want to hear stories, because we're people and we want to hear about people. We want to see how other people get along in their lives. When you tell a story and add that to the promise, all of a sudden it becomes something that's more connectable, something that's more understandable, because we've been there and now we see somebody else is there. So here's a headline: ex-lawyer gets booted from a Vegas casino, advanced way to make 1,339% market gain instead. Born with a club foot, plucked from an orphanage, kicked out of Caesar's palace for counting cards. Today he's one of the richest men in Europe and the inventor of a new way to make fast gains in the market. So it's going to go on and talk about the way that he does that market, but we're also going to talk about who this guy is. Now, he's a very strange character. How did he do this? What is he like? The first line here says, "Stu is shy," says the London Telegraph. So now he's famous. He's in the newspaper, and yet he's a shy guy with a club foot, and he did it, so maybe we can do it. Okay, so as an exercise, think about the product that you are writing about and try to dig up the stories that are connected to that product. So there are lots of ways you could do that. Find out who the founder is. Who is the person that is the champion of the product? Because every product has somebody that believed in it enough to make it, to make that effort, said, this is good, I ought to do this. And it usually goes way beyond more than saying, this is going to make me rich. It's, this is a great product. There's a reason that this should be out there. This solves a problem that needs solving. This is the first of its kind. This is the best of its kind. This is the antidote to the products out there that are not as good. Why did he do that? Why does he believe in it? What is he passionate about? Tell the story of how that came to be made. We told a couple of stories of some products that came about. And it's interesting to hear those stories. Now all of a sudden we've talked about the M&Ms, and I've told that story to people, and they say, I'm never going to look at an M&M the same way again, or a Kleenex that we talked about in some of the other sessions. Once you tell that story, it becomes real and connected, but at the center of that story are the people that made the decision to make that transition. Maybe you want to look at, like we talked about with that farmer who took the arthritis medicine, look at the testimonial stories. What have the customers been doing? How did that product change their lives in some way, hopefully for the better? And you can take that story and put that right up at the front. Show the product in action. Show that promise in action. Give it some dramatization. Show it working for another person who's just like you. Look for people who are using it behind the scenes in an unusual way. You know, I told that story about the Kleenex thing. They went along after that, and they ran ads for years that asked people to write in about the different ways they used Kleenex tissues. So people wrote in with hundreds of different ways of using them, and then they would go and they would tell the story about how they use them. This is Clara Johnson from New Jersey who uses her Kleenex tissues. It tells the stories of going along. I put them in my plants and use it to hold the dirt when I'm seeding the plants, or something like that. But it would go through and tell the stories, behind the scenes uses, okay. Consider how it fits into the product category evolution. How did the product change? What's the story of that product taking shape? What's different? Was it this way before, and now they've added some improvement to it, and why did they do that? How did that come about? Maybe what kind of technology changed the way that that product came about? Telling that story with a connection to the people who drive that story dramatizes what it is that you, or the message that it is you're trying to get across. So we have one more session. In that session, we're going to review the things that we talked about, and I'm going to talk about some of the ways that you can use what you've learned here in the series. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in session 9.